Hello, and welcome to our next session on design thinking for community change. My name is Jason Williams, one of the original partners of InnoPower, and currently serve as the managing director for the Society of Innovators at Purdue Northwest. We're a nonprofit organization tasked with driving community and economic change in Northwest Indiana through innovation and entrepreneurship. And so I'm excited to talk with our two panelists today. Just this additional work related to building ecosystems and a community around innovation. We're going to be talking specifically about design thinking and what exactly that means and how that is being used for innovation, not just in the business sector, but also for community change and development as we look at all of the missions of InnoPower this week that we're talking about as part of the InnoPower Minority Business Week, powered by JP Morgan Chase. And so first, wanted to introduce our two panelists, and this is always the fun part to brag on our panelists a little bit. I know everyone is always humble and doesn't love to read their own bio, but we love sharing bios of our speakers as we dive into these sessions. And so first, we're going to be hearing from Della Wilson. She is the founder and managing director of Axel Impact Studio, a global design practice at the nexus of creativity and collaboration. She also serves as social entrepreneur in residence at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. As a strategist and author, Della seeks to decolonize development efforts through the redirection of capital, cultural influence, and opportunity. She has worked across 8 countries to maximize corporate impact, seed public innovation in post-colonial states, design support for inclusive entrepreneurship, and implement equitable strategies for organizational development. Dell is a sought-after advisor on strategic and operational design, narrative strategy, inclusive product development, and leadership development with a unique lens that bridges operational structures with empathy, understanding that the personal is professional, and helping businesses navigate impactful approaches to social change. Second, we're going to hear from Terry Wada. Terry is the president and co-founder of Collabo Creative, an Indianapolis-based service design firm specializing in qualitative research and experience design. Terry has led countless successful service design initiatives, ranging from journey mapping one of the largest healthcare networks in Indiana to engaging thousands of residents in a citywide challenge to understand the conditions underlying youth violence. Additionally, Terry serves as adjunct faculty within the Visual Communication Design Department at Indiana University's Herron School of Art Design. Her work and research has attracted national grant funding and features in several international publications. As a design entrepreneur and leader, Terry has invited locally, nationally, and internationally to speak and present on topics surrounding design research, design thinking, and design education. So Della and Terry, it's a pleasure to meet you both, and thank you so much for joining us for the conversation. Obviously, those were two very mouthfuls of introductions, but Della, I'll turn to you first. If anything you want to add, just as far as saying hey and introducing yourself.
Sure. Well, first, thank you. Thank you. And it's such an honor to be in conversation with both you, Jason, and Terry as well. I'll just add to that, a little bit about me personally, born and raised in Birmingham, Alabama, and a first generation college student, first generation traveler outside of the United States, and someone that kind of crafted a career and really designed the approach to my life. And took a lot of risks in doing so. And so something I like to frame around the conversation is when we kind of read these bios and kind of put ourselves next to our professional achievements and labels and accomplishments, but we're just also people, and that personal experience is so important. And just want to lead with that. I've got a big family. We love barbecue, we love pickles, and we also love to change the world. So I'm really excited to be here with you, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. And Terry, yourself.
Same here. I would say thank you. I'm honored to be here and to be invited as a panelist. I love, Della, that you started with who you are as a person. So I'll share a little bit about who I am. Currently, I live in Indianapolis. However, I'm a transplant. I'm born and raised, luckily, born and raised in Hawaii, and grew up there, spent 30 years out there. I'm the youngest of 7, and I would say 3rd generation from an immigrant family. And so it's been an interesting journey to get here in the middle of the US, of all places, far away from my family. But it's just been such a blessing in the journey of learning more about what it's like to be, unique in a unique place. And so, I think it's really interesting when you move from one place to another, because then your experiences are completely different, and you have to start making sense of those. And I think that probably starts to tie with a lot of the things that we try to do in terms of all of the works that we're doing all together and understanding people's experiences.
Great. Yeah. Thank you both for such wonderful introductions, and also, who you are as people. We love hearing that. So let's dive into the topic today. We're talking about design thinking, and I know you two are similar. Myself, working in the innovation field and community building, I think it's easy that we take for granted, right? We hear terms like design thinking every day, and we just assume that everyone really understands what that means. But I've had conversations and have learned the hard way that there are people that have never seen design and thinking in the same sentence together, and so we don't want to take that for granted, right? So Terry, maybe starting with you, just maybe explain right at the one-on-one level, well, what is design thinking?
Yeah, so I actually take a very simplistic approach to design thinking in terms of how I define it, and there might be hundreds and hundreds of people out there that disagree with me, but I would say design thinking is really, it's the way we solve problems leveraging creativity. And it's as simple as that. It doesn't have to involve other people. We can absolutely use design thinking individually, but it's our innate human ability to leverage our creativity to solve problems through creative action, right? So by applying creative thought or making connections about things that we see and testing things out, kind of experimenting, we learn something in that. So really, design thinking is a learning model that's manifests as action, and through that we learn something new and then take action, and then hopefully are using that to solve a problem.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Terry. And Della, another related term that we often hear associated with design thinking is this concept of human-centered design. I guess from your perspective, is there a difference between human-centered design and design thinking? If so, what is that?
So in my perspective, there isn't, or there shouldn't be. But I also recognize that there are many different applications of design thinking, and kind of what makes design thinking so amazing is that as a process, it can be adapted and it can be redefined in so many different ways. So I do want to second Terry's point that, designing is a process. And a lot of times when we say design thinking or human-centered design, oftentimes our mind may go to like aesthetics, or I'm designing a product, or I'm a furniture designer, or I'm a painter, or I'm an artist. And it's like, yes. And you kind of put the same idea, the same framework of creativity or process to a different set of issues or problems or intended outcomes. So within our approach to this work, there is no difference between design thinking and human-centered design, because people are at the core of what we do and people are who we're solving for. But if you kind of take the term of human-centered design, it simply means that the user experience, which is also a word I actually don't like as much because I feel like it depersonifies people. The personal experience, the community experience is at the root of the process, and they actually are a part of the design process. Far too often, we have people designing, whether it is a cell phone or a policy, that are so far disconnected from the actual lived experience of those who will be the ones using the cell phone or actually benefiting or being harmed by the policy. Human-centered design says, hey, we want the people that are actually going to be recipients of this or experiencing this to be in the room at the time when those design decisions are made. So it's a power play. It's a democratization of power, and it's a reframing of who is going to be at the table when those decisions are made of what goes where, when does it go there, why does it go there. And to Terry's really amazing point, what do we learn from actually doing? That's what I love about design thinking is we're not just thinking all day. We're trying it. We're saying, hey, here are some connections. Let's put it to practice now. Let's learn from it, even with the smallest amount of budget or the shortest amount of time. What can we learn by just trying it? Take those lessons, and then we try it again.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And thank you both for really laying the framework for, what this is and why we're talking about it today. And so, we really did want to come together today to talk about design thinking, in the frame that this is, a problem solving, method for, even big, hairy challenges that we face. And so let's go ahead and just kind of jump into the deep end, right? We're not talking about, simple widgets and services today. And really, the lens that InnoPower is looking at, this year especially, is that the last 2 years, right? No secret that these have been extremely interesting, to say the least, but certainly intense, right? Between the COVID-19 pandemic, jarring acts of police brutality, a reawakening over the threads of systemic injustice, our hearts and minds had to wrestle with a lot of compounding forces over the recent years. And it's pretty safe to say we have all been changed in some way. As we think about leveraging design for innovation, how can we consider the broader implications of our decisions and acknowledge these threads of systemic injustice in order to realize a positive change? So, Della, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. Happy to start. I also love complex questions. And I also love and admit that this work sits in such complexity. When we think about, how do we acknowledge, how do we thread this reality into the work that we do? One of our core values and one of the first steps in our framework is awareness. And we recognize that if we're designing for systemic change, we have to recognize that we do not all operate from a place of shared understanding. We actively have movements right now that are trying to remove critical race theory out of textbooks. We have people questioning the validity and the authority of lived experiences and the truth of history. How can we design solutions if we won't even accept the truth of what actually got us here? And so that's one of the ways in which that we took a pivot from the traditional design thinking methodologies, which was like, hey, there's a gap here in context. And what does that context look like locally, hyper locally, right? Like there are many cities, if we get to, take us from the national and take us all the way down to like a county in Tulsa, Oklahoma. To what extent can we actually understand the historical frame of what happened in that county in Tulsa, Oklahoma over the course of the last 400 years to inform how we now design anew? So I would say that how we consider these broader implications is an awareness. We have to have a place of shared understanding that we can design from. And then secondly, I would say that we have to stop playing politics. I'm gonna be frank, and I come out of the political world, right? Politics is not our friend. Politics is a game of money, and politics is a game that is not rooted in ethics. And if we're talking about redesigning systems, we have to talk about our values, not about our politics. It's beyond that. It's beyond parties and how I feel about this and how much money I want to put here. What do we value as human beings, and what is a life that we want to design in harmony with one another? And I want us to get back to our roots and our values and beliefs, and so we can now be designing anew from that frame.
Yeah, thanks, Della. Terry, did you have any thoughts?
I would just second Della's sentiments and kind of add to that, because I think where we can leverage some of what design thinking or human-centered design practices bring into the space is that radical empathic listening. Because how do we get on the same page, right? How do we have a shared understanding of our history and our past if we aren't willing to radically and empathically listen to each other, right? There's been so many times that I've been in conversations with people in different, from different backgrounds, different stakeholders, where just exactly to what Della had specified, they are negating people's experiences, right? And saying basically, well, that's not true, right? What you experienced is not true. And at the core of human-centered design is that every human is the expert of their own experience. And so in the same vein, Jason, I can't know what your experience is. And the only person who has the truth behind that experience is you. And so the only way for us as a collective creative community to begin to work together is to acknowledge your truth, that this is where you come from and this is what your truth is, and give people the space through that radical listening, right? And I think that's where, from my standpoint, there isn't enough empathic listening. Empathy, I think also it's a double-edged sword that I don't think people see. They always say we need to be more empathic, but there is a side to empathy that can be destructive when we start to see ourselves in someone else and say, I have that experience, so I know how you feel. And that's where that listening really comes into place.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. And I guess one, kind of a follow up here, and Della, you mentioned right how we're kind of discovering these truths, or identifying gaps in our context or understanding and definition of maybe a challenge. And Terry, obviously, a lot of your work, that empathic listening you mentioned, right, call it the qualitative research side of innovation. I guess help us explain then, if we look at a lot of rhetoric maybe around the numbers, right? Follow the science, follow the polls, and we see a lot of the quantitative data side of this. I guess how do you balance, both of you? How do you balance your work, with the numbers? Maybe especially when there may be two different outcomes sometimes to what you're actually seeing number wise versus hearing on the ground.
Yeah, phenomenal question. I'm actually like dealing with this right now. I'm in Baltimore. I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, with the Center for Government Excellence and the Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation. This is a data house. They are both in the business of helping local governments better collect, analyze, and use data for better policy outcomes. And the reality is that across the United States, Latin America, and Canada, the way in which we define demographic data, collect it, and analyze it is extremely problematic. We have intentionally not collected data on certain groups of people because what it illuminates are disparities that some of us do not want to accept as truth. And so when you're navigating that reality, how do you properly advise folks to now not only change the frame in which they see the world, and also, recognize that we have to define the myriads of identities of the folks that make up this beautiful world, and also create space for them in the data. But to the point that, this is a balance between quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative data leaves a lot of context out. And so how do we admit what's left out? How do we talk about what's left out? How do we talk about and bring stories to also bring life to the data and remind ourselves that numbers are people too, and these numbers and these graphs and these analytics will never tell the whole story. Something that I noticed very early in my career, and I encourage everyone that's listening, is when you're reading a study, or seeing the outcomes of some quantitative study, is to look at who they surveyed. Like, was this actually a representative sample? Not only in terms of the number of people surveyed, but what's the breakdown of that group? Oftentimes, are they even from the community that they said they were? Sometimes they're not. A lot of things can get hidden in data that looks like it's very valid because it appears very pretty in a graph or in a cool table. But we've got to be a little bit more critical about, where that data came from, what it's saying, and are we actually responsibly sharing a narrative that brings in the qualitative side, the human side, the personal side of the story.
Yeah, thank you. And Terry, anything that you might add? And I guess also with the context, knowing that a lot of your work is on that qualitative side, but also a lot of your work is focused here in Central Indiana. That a large part of the network watching and we're engaging with through InnoPower this year is located. So I guess with that, anything you would add?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like we're just partners far away. Like this. I'm like on the same page. Yes. So and I just want to tack on to that because based off of what you were saying, it's really about building the story, right? Data is data, and we use it to tell stories, and that's what becomes really important. And so any research, and this is where when we look at research, it's not necessarily the qualitative versus the quantitative, which is a lot of times how maybe analysts pit them against each other. Mm-hmm. It's all information, and you can't get the whole story with only one side, right? It's like Jason asking you about all of your experiences and not asking your wife. Like, that's a really incomplete picture. And so quantitative and qualitative absolutely work together. It's for us, it's the symbiosis of context and content. Right. You have to understand the space around what you are looking at. And that's where the qualitative comes in. The qualitative tells you why things are happening. It tells you the richness of their experiences. And then even looking at what kinds of data sets exist, right? Qualitative, quantitative is one thing, but what are the layers? Who are we looking at, right? Are we looking at both sides of a picture? So within, I would say let's make it more simple. So we can, it's always hard to talk about complex things with complex things. So let's talk about something simple, like an organization, right? If you have an experience, let's say you're going to a coffee shop and you're only looking at the customer experience, that's only one side of the picture, right? You also have to look at what are the baristas experiencing? What does that look like? What does the entire space and the environment look like, right? That's all of that space, and you can look at it both qualitative and quantitatively. But that's where we can start to use our data and use how we leverage research in design thinking approaches or innovation approaches to tell stories. Because that's what really becomes important, is that we're looking at the whole story and not just half the story. And to Della's point, making sure that we are constantly questioning, right? Who's missing? Who are the missing stakeholders? Who are the missing actors in this picture that we're not getting their stories from?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you both. Very insightful. Great conversation and answers there. Appreciate that. And I guess this will be where we introduce another concept related to this, but I know it's relevant to both of your work. So we also have this idea of regenerative or restorative design. I guess if you wouldn't mind kind of taking what does defining that regenerative design, and then how might it differ from design thinking we think about, and then why does this matter?
Sure, I'm happy to start. And full disclosure, I'm going to put one more word in there too. Because jargon is jargon, but we're gonna define it. It's interesting because like restorative design and regenerative design are typically understood in like the environmental space, right. Or even like in the architecture space. And like traditionally they're both frames for us thinking about how do we reverse the damage that's been caused by either nature or humans. But it's the context originally was as applied to land, water, and ecosystems, as applied to the environment. And logically, that makes sense. And also you can think about, well, how do we reverse the damage that's been caused by humans as applied to humans? And so that frame is the frame that we use. But we actually have reframed it another layer to call it reparative design. And you're following, the movement for reparations. It's aligned with that. It's a recognition that there has been hurt and harm caused within the context of a specific industry, a role, a company, an organization. How do we frame the repair that needs to occur between that particular actor or collective of actors and the communities that they directly interact with? And so Axel's framework is built around a reparative design approach. And it really kind of asks us to first center in a shared understanding of systems, where we balance self-awareness with institutional responsibility. When we recognize that, hey, institutions are collectives of people, and also institutions in relationship to one another cause harm. So we cannot separate that individual actor from an institution. We have to look at it both, our personal values and beliefs, and the actions and collective actions that we as a team or a group or an institution take in relationship to other institutions. We then ask our communities to contextualize a challenge or an issue in relation to its past and current operating environments. That gets us back to that shared understanding, like how did we get here? Where did we come from? And then we co-create. We're designers, we are creatives, solutions. So we co-create with our community different sorts of tools or projects or programs or studies that can help us get to that transformative change. We synthesize, we pilot, and we do it again. But we always go back to that same centering in our shared understanding, that acceptance of both personal and institutional responsibility prior to the creation of new ideas and the testing of those ideas.
Perfect. Thank you, Della. Yeah, Terry, anything you would add?
I same thing. I still love it, and I just to kind of tag on to that, I think it harkens back to the fact that we're humans, human to human, right? Human to human contact, human to human interaction, and that has to do with relationships. So you cannot regenerate a relationship, right? You cannot. That's not something like, oh, the relationship's gone, let's just push the button and restart the relationship. It doesn't work that way. It is about repairing damage. And I love that it does start with that one, acknowledging that damage has been done. You have to first acknowledge that this relationship is not healthy, that there's things here that are wrong before we can even start to think, how do we repair that damage? And I love, Della, that you had said, it's both sides, both individual personal work, as well as organizations, communities, agencies, governments, right? Like all of those different levels and layers, because there's all of these entities consist of people, and those people have relationships, and that's where we're wanting to repair those relationships. It takes a lot of work, and it's not easy. And I think a lot of it usually has to do with how do you build trust, right?
Yes.
How do you build that trust, that safe space? Because there's baggage there with relationships. There's baggage, and so how do you help people move forward when they've been burned before, when they've been unheard before, when they've been ignored before, when they've been through things in the past and nothing's changed, right? If we can't acknowledge that, we can't even try to have a conversation because there's no trust.
And to that point, Terry, like that requires time. And I think that's one of the most challenging aspects of this work is if we're going to acknowledge the harm, the trauma, the break in relationship, and our goal is to now repair that relationship, to redesign a new approach, contextualized to that reality, we also have to be realistic about the time that it takes. And oftentimes, whether it's funders or government, or sometimes even community members that want and should have a solution or an answer now, it's always a challenge to balance those expectations around the realities in time. And if you just think about, when you have been harmed by a friend, or maybe someone you're dating, or maybe a parent, like maybe an apology has been given, maybe you've seen a change in behavior, and maybe you're still holding on to resentment or to hurt, right? That takes time for us to release. And so, one thing that, although I love like kind of lean startup methodology, and I love the pace at which design thinking allows us to move and try new things, I also find that we have to find a better approach for holding space for the time required to repair and to heal as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't heal wounds without that time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, man, thank you both. It's good stuff. And I guess as we look at this, reparative design, restorative design, we are having some conversations this week, specifically with some community members. And I know, Terry, you're part of some of this facilitation and work related to this. But there are a couple topics that we're really trying to wrap this framework around. If you look at branding Black Indianapolis, supporting Black businesses, and then in general, just our education and talent development pipelines. I guess knowing that we do have a mix of, Terry, you're kind of hands-on, involved in some of these conversations this week, and Della, obviously, right in the same space, just a different part of the country currently. I guess thinking about topics like that and this process, I guess what might be some of your thoughts on, okay, we're having great conversations this week. What next? I guess what advice would you have on expected outcomes, or what to look forward to when you do have these powerful conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm super excited about these sessions moving forward, because it's just an opportunity to, again, like open our ears and just really listen to the community and listen to the folks who are involved in this space, because there is huge disparities, right, for Black folks in Indianapolis in these different areas, from being able to be attractive as a city so that Black professionals and Black folks want to actually live in the city because it feels welcoming, it feels like a place where they belong, as well as being able to develop the Black talent that's already here in the city, from grade school to high school, all the way into the universities and into professional, and not that you have to go to college, because you don't have to go to college, but being able to develop the talent that's here, and also starting to figure out entrepreneurship is important, hugely important, right? It's for any thriving city. And how do we help our Black businesses thrive in this atmosphere as well, given that there seems to be so many resources being poured into this pool, and for years, I would say, right, there's money being poured into trying to address some of these disparities. But I think what we've seen in the communities is there hasn't been a lot of impact, maybe not as much as folks would like to see. And I think one thing to keep in mind as outcomes is that we're not going to solve these 3 problems in 3 hours. Like, that's just not going to happen, right? We've just talked about how it takes time to repair these relationships. But I think what can be a very important outcome is that this is a first step in listening. This is a first step to rebuilding or repairing that relationship, because people have been burned in the past. People have not been heard. Voices have not been shared, or they've been shared and not really leveraged in shaping of new policies, new programs, new services. And so if we can shape these conversations to help people know that, one, we're here to listen. Because being one of the facilitators in this session, I don't know what it's like to be a Black business owner. I do know what it is to be a minority business owner, but I can't impose my experience on other folks' experiences. And so we need to start with listening. And so our goal is to really help open those, I don't want to say like help people open their ears, but for lack of a better phrasing, helping folks to open their ears, right? Because we have the opportunity to bring in multiple stakeholders, from business support organizations to actual Black business owners and other minority business owners, right? So if we can start to help everyone listen empathically across the table and not impose our prejudgments or pre-understandings of all of the things that we've seen in the past, not apply that to each other, but really just sit down and share a conversation so that business support organizations can hear what Black business owners are going through. And just being able to say, I hear you. And maybe not even saying I'm ready to solve that problem, but saying, I hear you, and that's the first step. And I want to continue hearing you. And then I want you to help me figure out how we work together to address these problems. Sorry, that was a little long.
No, that's great. Thank you, Terry. And then Della, I guess just to wrap up with you on that note, right? I mean, we have these big fuzzy community challenges. There's going to be a lot of great listening, a lot of great sharing. I guess in your experience, how do we make sure that this isn't just done in vain this week, right? That what we're hearing from it continues to we continue to hold that conversation, but more importantly, we do something with it. So I guess what does that look like?
Absolutely. Thank you for this question. Actually, this is one of my favorite things to reference. Peter Senge, who is a management professor out of MIT, and he does a lot of work around systems and relationships and what it means to redesign systems through relationships. And something that he states in his work is that, systems redesign, it's not a matter of, or the gap is not between what we know and what we don't know. It's actually between what we know and what we do. And, I said a couple years ago, I was like in this space where I was just so tired of researching. And I was so like, if somebody calls me one more time for another paper to explain a problem that is understood, as opposed to investing in the solution, I'm going to scream. And so, it's kind of one of those things that it's where I run a little bit contradictory to my own methodology, which is we absolutely always have to be in a consistent feedback loop of what people are experiencing, of who they are, of how we contextualize this. And we can't get stuck in that feedback loop of only having conversations when we do actually have the ability and perspective to now do something about it. And so something that I always like to do, and I want to encourage folks that are in these sessions, whether this is the first time that they have practiced empathic listening, or they have done this many times and maybe they're feeling burnt out from it, to say, all right, at the end of this 3-hour session, we have now a number of different opportunities and gaps. And what can we commit to in this room right now to do right now? What can you do with the person that's sitting next to you? How can you support a Black-owned business later this afternoon? How can you use your skills to maybe barter and exchange and support, or make an introduction, or right? We don't have to just wait for the broad solution or the massive investment. Going back to the points that Terry and I made earlier, that this is relational, it's people to people. And so like Terry and Jason, how can we work together and help each other? And I'm sure that each of us have a question right now that probably someone else on the call has the answer to, right? And so let's also think about what are the immediate action steps that we can take before we leave the room to start to put those learnings into practice.
Yeah, thank you. Well said. Appreciate that. And so as we wrap up our time here during this conversation, just want to kind of turn it back to both of you again to share a little bit more about the work you're doing. So I'll just close out with Della, starting with you. Just what is something you're working on right now you're really excited about?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the work with the Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation. It's a brand new center launched out of Johns Hopkins University that's really helping to kind of bring together a global creative community to help spur innovation in the public sector. We know that government is one of bureaucracy, and they are the slowest to innovate. And so what does it mean when you infuse technologists and creatives and kind of rebel rousers and activists and community organizers into that space to start to redesign what are the processes of government that can allow us to be more responsive, to be more engaging, but ultimately to rebuild trust relationships. So really excited to be working with the Love Your Block team, which focuses on issuing grants to neighborhood and community-based organizations to support neighborhood blight, eradication of neighborhood blight. And we're embedding racial equity into the process design and the program design of that work, and helping to build the capacity of local government leaders to navigate this work in an ethical and responsible way. So really excited about that. And also really excited about working with the InnoPower team and getting my hands dirty in Indiana as well.
Perfect. Thank you. And Terry, we know your team is excited about the InnoPower work as well. But what else is happening at Collabo? Anything exciting that you want to share?
I was going to say, this sounds like a trick question. I think I'm just supposed to say InnoPower, which is a fact, though. We are very excited for those sessions. Aside from that, first I wanted to be like, Della, that sounds amazing. I love what you all are working on. So we're actually diving pretty heavy into looking at what does the patient experience look like, and the disparities that exist in equity when we look at healthcare and the healthcare system. Specifically, we're going to be looking at emergency departments across the state of Indiana, partnering with IU Health, because they have been a fantastic partner in identifying that there are disparities in patient experiences based off of racial backgrounds, or just based off of equity differences, right? So folks not having the same kind of access to care, folks not having the same kind of treatment within the hospitals based off of who they are, where they come from, how they talk, or what they look like, right? And so they are kind of spearheading an initiative to find out what's going on in that space and how do we then address it. So we're super excited to take part in that, and be able to be boots on the ground, talking to folks in these emergency departments, finding out how do we make healthcare better for them.
Awesome. Great stuff. Well, Terry, Della, thank you so much, both of you, for taking your time to just share your experiences and your insights with us this year at InnoPower. We really do appreciate that. And that wraps up our conversation around design thinking. Certainly encourage you to stay in touch with Della at Axel Impact Studio and Terry at Collabo Creative here in Indianapolis. But enjoy the rest of the virtual conference. Again, this is the InnoPower Minority Business Week, powered by JP Morgan Chase. Enjoy the rest of the sessions.